Have you ever stood in front of a crowd of people who love you, wearing the dress you dreamed about since childhood, only to realize that the person standing across from you is about to humiliate you in the worst way possible? That's exactly where I found myself on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I almost married a monster, how he tried to break me publicly at our own wedding, and how I found the courage to escape his control and expose the abuse that nearly destroyed me. I need to tell you this story because I know there are others out there who might be living through something similar, and if my experience can help even one person recognize the signs and get out, then reliving this nightmare will be worth it. When I think back to that day, standing there in my ivory lace gown with 200 guests watching, I can still feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine, the way my bouquet trembled in my hands, and the exact moment when I saw the cruel glint in his eyes that told me he was about to do something terrible. But to understand how I got there, to really grasp the psychological prison I had been living in, I need to take you back to the beginning, to show you how a relationship that started with rose petals and promises slowly morphed into a nightmare of control, manipulation, and systematic emotional abuse that almost cost me everything, including my sense of self. I met Daniel 3 years before that wedding day, at a charity fundraiser where I was volunteering for a local animal shelter. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: successful, charismatic, attentive, and seemingly kind. He wore expensive suits that fit him perfectly, had this confident smile that made everyone in the room turn to look at him, and when he approached me that evening, I felt like I had won some kind of lottery. He told me he had been watching me all night, admiring how passionate I was when talking to potential adopters about the rescue dogs, and he said there was something genuine about me that he found refreshing in a world full of fake people. I remember blushing, feeling seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. My previous relationship had ended badly 8 months earlier, and I had been focusing on rebuilding myself, rediscovering who I was without someone else defining me. But Daniel made me feel special, chosen, like I was the only woman in the world who mattered. He asked for my number, and when I hesitated for just a second, he looked almost hurt, his dark eyes clouding over with what I interpreted as vulnerability. He said he understood if I wasn't interested, that he probably wasn't good enough for someone like me anyway. And that self-deprecating honesty made me immediately want to reassure him. So I gave him my number, and he texted me before I even left the venue that night, thanking me for giving him a chance. Our first date was magical, or at least that's how I remember it through the filter of those early days. He took me to this intimate Italian restaurant where the owner knew him by name, and he ordered for both of us in perfect Italian, explaining each dish with such enthusiasm that I found myself hanging on every word. He asked me questions about my life, my dreams, my fears, and he listened with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most fascinating person he had ever met. He told me about his childhood, about losing his mother to cancer when he was 12, about how his father had become distant and cold afterward, and about how he had built his successful tech company from nothing, driven by a need to prove himself worthy of love. I felt such compassion for him, such a desire to be the person who could finally make him feel loved and secure. He walked me to my car that night, and when he kissed me goodnight, it was gentle and respectful, and he told me he couldn't wait to see me again. Within weeks, we were inseparable, and within 3 months, he told me he loved me during a weekend trip to the coast where we watched the sunset from our hotel balcony. I said it back without hesitation because I believed I felt it too. Believed that this whirlwind romance was the universe finally giving me what I deserved after years of disappointment. But looking back now, with the clarity that comes from distance and therapy, I can see all the red flags I missed, all the warning signs I dismissed as quirks or expressions of love. It started so subtly that I didn't even notice it was happening. About 4 months into our relationship, Daniel started making little comments about my friends. He would say things like how he noticed that my friend Jessica always seemed to undermine me in conversations, or how my college roommate Emma seemed jealous of our relationship. At first, I defended my friends, but Daniel was so calm and rational in his observations, presenting what he called evidence of their negative influence on my life, that I started to second-guess my own perceptions. He never outright told me to stop seeing them. Instead, he would plan elaborate dates or surprise trips on the same days I had plans with friends, and when I hesitated to cancel on them, he would get this wounded look on his face and say he understood, that obviously my friends were more important than our relationship, and that he should have known better than to think someone like me would prioritize him. The guilt was crushing, and I found myself gradually choosing him over them, telling myself that it was normal to spend more time with your partner than your friends, that this was what commitment looked like. By our 6-month anniversary, I had essentially cut ties with most of my close friends, not because he directly told me to, but because the emotional manipulation made it feel like my choice, like I was choosing love over superficial friendships that didn't really understand me anyway. The financial control came next, disguised as generosity and concern for our future together. Daniel started paying for everything when we went out, insisting that he made more money than me, and that it was his pleasure to take care of me. When I protested, wanting to maintain my independence, he would act hurt and say that he wanted to spoil me, that refusing his gifts felt like I was rejecting him. He upgraded my phone, saying my old one was unreliable, and he worried about not being able to reach me. He bought me a new laptop for work, claiming mine was too slow, and he couldn't stand watching me struggle with outdated technology. He even insisted on paying off my credit card debt, which wasn't substantial but was something I had been working on clearing myself. He presented it as an investment in our future, saying that we were a team now and that my debt was our debt, and that it made more financial sense for him to pay it off given his higher income and better credit score. I was uncomfortable but also relieved and touched by his apparent generosity. What I didn't realize until much later was that each of these gifts was another chain binding me to him, another way he was creating a situation where I would feel obligated to stay, where leaving would mean feeling like I owed him something I could never repay. Around the 8-month mark, Daniel suggested I move in with him. He had this beautiful modern apartment in the city with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, and my cramped studio felt increasingly depressing in comparison. He painted this picture of domestic bliss, waking up together every morning, cooking dinner together every evening, building a real life as partners. He said my lease was coming up anyway, that it made no sense for me to waste money on rent when I could live with him for free and save up for our future. My family had concerns. My sister pulled me aside and said she thought things were moving too fast, that she barely recognized me anymore since I had been with Daniel. But I was defensive, convinced that she just didn't understand our connection, that she was jealous of the love I had found. So I moved in, and at first it felt like playing house, like we were newlyweds even though we hadn't even discussed marriage yet. But within weeks, the apartment that had felt like a sanctuary started to feel like a cage. Daniel wanted to know where I was at all times, who I was talking to, what I was doing. He installed security cameras throughout the apartment, saying it was for our safety, but I noticed he checked the footage obsessively whenever I was home alone. He had access to my phone because we had shared our locations and passwords for emergencies, but I started noticing that he would read my texts and emails, later bringing up conversations I had never told him about in ways that made it clear he had been monitoring everything. The psychological warfare intensified after I moved in, taking forms I couldn't have anticipated and didn't know how to fight against. Daniel started undermining my self-esteem in ways that felt like they were designed to systematically dismantle my confidence. He would make comments about my appearance, saying he was just trying to help me be the best version of myself. He suggested I lose a few pounds, that my clothes were too frumpy and didn't reflect well on him in professional settings, that I should consider Botox even though I was only 28, because prevention was better than cure. He criticized my job, saying I was wasting my potential working at a nonprofit when I could be making real money, that my career choice seemed more like a hobby than a profession, that it was embarrassing when his colleagues asked what my girlfriend did for a living. He nitpicked everything. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I folded laundry, the way I organized the pantry, always with this condescending tone that suggested I was incompetent at basic life tasks. When I tried to stand up for myself, he would gaslight me, saying I was being too sensitive, that he was only trying to help me improve, that if I really loved him, I would appreciate his feedback instead of getting defensive. He had this way of twisting every conversation so that I ended up apologizing even when I had done nothing wrong, doubting my own memories and perceptions, questioning whether I was the problem in our relationship. The isolation became nearly complete when Daniel convinced me to quit my job. He had been complaining about my work schedule for months, saying I was never home when he needed me, that my job was causing stress in our relationship, that we barely had time together anymore. The breaking point came after I had to work late 3 nights in a row during a major fundraising campaign, and Daniel exploded in a way I had never seen before. He screamed at me about how selfish I was, how I clearly cared more about stray animals than about him, how he was beginning to question whether I was actually working late or using it as an excuse to avoid him. The rage in his eyes terrified me, and for the first time, I genuinely feared he might physically hurt me. The next morning, he was calm again, apologetic in his way, and he sat me down to have what he called a serious discussion about our future. He said he had been thinking about proposing, about starting a family, but that he couldn't do that with someone who prioritized their career over their relationship. He offered me a deal: quit my job and he would support me financially while I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life, maybe started my own business or went back to school. He said he made more than enough for both of us, that it would actually reduce his stress to know I was home and safe rather than running around the city at all hours. He made it sound so reasonable, so much like the logical next step in building our life together. My gut screamed at me not to do it, not to give up the last piece of independence I had left, but I was exhausted from the constant fighting, worn down by months of manipulation, and I convinced myself that maybe he was right, that maybe my job was the problem and quitting would fix everything. So I gave my 2 weeks' notice, and my boss looked at me with such concern that I almost broke down right there in her office. She told me I always had a place to come back to, and even though I didn't understand why at the time, I felt like she was trying to tell me something important that I wasn't ready to hear. Without my job, I became completely dependent on Daniel, and that's when his control became absolute. I had no income of my own, no reason to leave the apartment most days, no colleagues to interact with or schedule to maintain. Daniel monitored everything, what I ate, what I watched on TV, how I spent my time while he was at work. He would call or text multiple times throughout the day, and if I didn't respond immediately, he would accuse me of hiding something or ignoring him on purpose. He started tracking my every move through the location app on my phone, and if I went anywhere without telling him first, even just to the grocery store or for a walk around the block, he would interrogate me about where I had been, who I had seen, why I felt the need to sneak around behind his back. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in on me, but I also felt trapped because I had nowhere to go and no money to get there. My relationship with my family had deteriorated to occasional awkward phone calls where I pretended everything was fine because I was too ashamed to admit that everyone had been right about Daniel. I had pushed away all my friends, quit my job, moved into his apartment, and allowed him to pay off my debts, which he now held over my head whenever I dared to complain about anything. He would remind me of everything he had done for me, everything he had given me, and ask how I could be so ungrateful, so spoiled, so unable to appreciate the life he had provided for me. Then, 8 months after I moved in and 5 months after I quit my job, Daniel proposed. It should have been romantic, but instead, it felt like a business transaction, another step in his master plan to own me completely. He didn't get down on one knee or make a heartfelt speech. He simply presented me with a ring one evening after dinner and told me we were getting married. There was no question in his words, no "will you marry me?" Just a statement of fact. We were getting married and this was the ring I would wear. It was a massive diamond, ostentatious and expensive, the kind of ring that was meant to broadcast his wealth and success rather than symbolize our love. When I hesitated, when I didn't immediately squeal with joy like the women in commercials, his face darkened, and he asked me what the problem was, whether I had someone else, whether I had been planning to leave him after everything he had invested in me. The word invested stuck in my mind because that's exactly what I was to him. An investment, a possession, something he had purchased and now expected a return on. I put the ring on and told him yes, I would marry him, because by that point I didn't know how to say no, didn't know how to escape, and some part of me still believed that maybe marriage would fix things, that maybe the commitment would ease his insecurity and jealousy, that maybe I could love him enough to heal whatever was broken inside him that made him treat me this way. The wedding planning was a nightmare that lasted 4 months and stripped away any remaining illusions I had about our relationship. Daniel took control of every single decision, dismissing my opinions as irrelevant or stupid whenever they differed from his vision. He chose the venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band, the color scheme, the decorations, everything. When I suggested I might want a smaller, more intimate wedding, he told me not to be ridiculous, that this wedding was important for his business relationships and social standing, that we needed to make a statement. He invited 200 guests, most of whom were his colleagues, clients, or business associates, while I was allowed to invite only a handful of people from my dwindling social circle. He insisted I lose 15 pounds before the wedding, hiring a personal trainer who worked me to exhaustion and put me on a restrictive diet that left me constantly hungry and irritable. He took me to multiple bridal salons, rejecting dress after dress as not elegant enough, not sexy enough, not expensive enough, until he finally chose one that he liked and told me that was the one I would wear. It cost $8,000, and every time I looked at it hanging in our closet, I felt sick. He controlled my hair appointments, my makeup trials, my skincare routine, scrutinizing every aspect of my appearance with the critical eye of someone designing a showpiece rather than marrying a human being he supposedly loved. As the wedding day approached, I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night unable to breathe, my heart racing so fast I thought I might die. Daniel would find me in these states, and instead of comforting me, he would get angry, telling me I was being dramatic, that I was going to ruin the wedding with my anxiety, that I needed to pull myself together. He made me go to a doctor who prescribed anti-anxiety medication, and Daniel monitored my intake of the pills like he monitored everything else in my life. I felt like I was watching my own life from outside my body, like I was a puppet going through the motions while someone else pulled the strings. The night before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner, my sister pulled me aside in the bathroom and begged me not to go through with it. She had tears streaming down her face, and she grabbed my hands and said she could see that I was miserable, that this wasn't love, that it wasn't too late to walk away. I wanted so badly to collapse into her arms and confess everything, to tell her about the monitoring and the control and the manipulation and the way Daniel had systematically destroyed every piece of who I used to be. But I couldn't form the words. Instead, I told her she was wrong, that she didn't understand our relationship, that I loved Daniel and he loved me, and that I would appreciate it if she could be supportive on my wedding day. The hurt in her eyes haunts me still, but I was so deep in the fog of abuse that I couldn't see the lifeline she was throwing me. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with a sense of impending doom so profound that I vomited twice before the hair and makeup team arrived. Daniel had stayed at a hotel the night before, maintaining the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony, and for those few hours, I was alone with my thoughts for the first time in what felt like forever. As the stylist worked on transforming me into Daniel's vision of the perfect bride, I stared at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. I had lost weight to the point where my collarbones protruded sharply, my cheeks were hollow, and my eyes looked haunted and empty. The makeup artist kept commenting on how I needed to smile, that I looked too serious for a bride on her wedding day, but I couldn't muster even a fake smile. My hands shook as I stepped into that $8,000 dress, and when they zipped it up, I felt like I was being sealed into a coffin. My sister arrived to help me get ready, and we moved around each other in painful silence, both of us knowing that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but unable or unwilling to stop it. She helped me put on my veil, and as she secured it into my hair, I felt a tear slide down my cheek, which the makeup artist immediately rushed to fix, tutting about how we didn't have time for emotional moments that would ruin my mascara. The ceremony was held in a historic mansion with manicured gardens, everything expensive and elegant and completely impersonal. As I waited in the bridal suite for my cue to walk down the aisle, I could hear the string quartet playing outside and the murmur of 200 guests taking their seats. My father appeared to walk me down the aisle, and when he saw me, his face fell. He asked me if I was sure about this, if this was really what I wanted, and I could see the concern in his eyes that mirrored my sister's. But I had gone too far to turn back now, or at least that's what I told myself. The financial investment, the guests who had traveled from out of town, the deposits that couldn't be refunded, the humiliation of calling it off at the last minute, all of these things seemed like insurmountable barriers to escape. So I took my father's arm and we walked out into the sunshine, and I started down that long aisle toward Daniel, who was waiting at the altar with the minister beside him. Have you ever walked towards something knowing it was going to destroy you but feeling powerless to stop? That's what those steps felt like, each one taking me closer to a fate I knew I couldn't survive, but couldn't avoid. Daniel looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile charming and confident as he watched me approach. To everyone gathered there, we probably looked like the perfect couple, the successful businessman and his beautiful bride, a fairy tale romance culminating in this elegant celebration. But as I got closer, as I could finally see his eyes clearly, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was no love in those eyes, no joy, no tenderness. Instead, there was possession, triumph, and something else. Something cruel that I had seen flashes of before, but never quite this clearly. When I reached the altar and my father placed my hand in Daniel's, I felt the grip of his fingers harder than necessary, a warning and a claim of ownership all at once. The minister began the ceremony, his words washing over me like white noise as I stood there trying to remember how to breathe. Daniel was staring at me with an intensity that felt predatory, and I realized with horrible clarity that he was enjoying my discomfort, feeding off my fear, savoring this moment of absolute control over me in front of everyone we knew. The ceremony proceeded according to script until we reached the vows. The minister invited Daniel to recite his vows first, and this is where everything went catastrophically wrong. Daniel had insisted on writing his own vows, and he had refused to let me hear them beforehand, saying he wanted them to be a surprise. As he began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent garden where 200 people hung on his every word. I realized that this wasn't going to be a declaration of love. It was going to be a public execution. He started innocently enough, talking about the day we met, but then his words took a darker turn. He began listing all of my flaws, all of my failures, all of the ways I had disappointed him during our relationship, framing each criticism as something he had graciously forgiven or patiently tolerated. He talked about my weight gain before I lost it for the wedding, about my dead-end job that he had saved me from, about my difficult personality that drove friends away, about my constant neediness and insecurity that exhausted him. With each word, I felt my soul shrinking, my face burning with humiliation, as I heard gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. He wasn't being subtle or clever. He was openly mocking me, belittling me, destroying me in front of everyone I knew, and he was doing it with a smile on his face like it was all part of the ceremony. He talked about how much work I had been, how he had molded me and shaped me into someone worthy of being his wife, how I should be grateful that he was willing to take on the project of fixing all my many deficiencies. The minister looked horrified. My sister let out a choked sob from where she stood as my maid of honor, and I could see my father starting to move forward as if to intervene, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by shock and humiliation and the devastating realization that this had been his plan all along. This was the moment Daniel had been building toward for 3 years, the ultimate assertion of his power over me, the public demonstration that he owned me so completely that he could humiliate me in front of everyone I knew, and I would still marry him because I had no other choice, nowhere else to go, no life to return to. He concluded his vows by saying that despite all my flaws, despite how difficult I made things, he was generous enough, patient enough, loving enough to marry me anyway, and that I should spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his sacrifice. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by someone's uncomfortable cough and my sister's poorly suppressed crying. Daniel stood there looking at me with this expectant expression, waiting for me to recite my vows, waiting for me to complete this ritual of my own destruction, waiting for me to seal my fate as his possession forever. And in that moment, standing there in my $8,000 dress with my carefully styled hair and professionally applied makeup, something inside me finally broke free. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as the charming man who had swept me off my feet, not as the successful partner who had generously taken care of me, but as the abuser who had spent 3 years systematically destroying every piece of who I was. I saw the pattern of control and manipulation, the calculated isolation, the financial dependence, the constant criticism disguised as concern, the monitoring and gaslighting and psychological torture, all leading to this moment where he thought he had won, where he thought he had broken me so completely that I would accept this final humiliation and bind myself to him forever. And I realized with sudden crystal clarity that I still had a choice. It wasn't too late. Yes, it would be embarrassing. Yes, it would be difficult. Yes, there would be consequences. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could be worse than spending the rest of my life married to this man who didn't love me, who had never loved me, who viewed me as an object to possess and control, rather than a human being worthy of respect and genuine affection. I could feel my heart pounding, could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders, and I knew that what I did in the next 30 seconds would determine the entire course of my future. I took off the engagement ring, that ostentatious diamond that had always felt like a shackle rather than a symbol of love, and I placed it in Daniel's hand. His face registered confusion first, then disbelief, then pure rage as he realized what was happening. I dropped my bouquet, and the sound of it hitting the ground seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Then I spoke, and my voice was shaking but clear. No, just that one word, but it contained everything. Every violation he had committed, every boundary he had crossed, every piece of myself I was reclaiming in that moment. Before he could respond, before he could try to manipulate me or gaslight me or convince me I was being crazy, I turned and started walking back down the aisle, away from him, away from the life he had constructed to imprison me. I could hear the chaos erupting behind me, Daniel's voice raised in anger, my sister calling my name, the shocked exclamations of the guests. But I didn't stop. I walked faster, then started running, my heels clicking on the stone pathway, my dress billowing around me, my veil coming loose and trailing behind me, like a white flag of surrender to everything I had been, and a declaration of war on everything I was refusing to become. I made it to the bridal suite, locked the door, and immediately began tearing off the wedding dress with shaking hands. My sister was pounding on the door within seconds, begging me to let her in, and when I did, she rushed in and wrapped me in her arms while I sobbed into her shoulder, the most cleansing tears I had cried in 3 years. She helped me change into the jeans and t-shirt I had arrived in that morning, helped me gather my few personal belongings, and then she did something I will never forget. She looked me directly in the eyes and told me she was proud of me, that walking away took more courage than going through with it would have, and that I always had a home with her for as long as I needed one. My parents appeared next, my father saying he had wanted to stop the ceremony the moment Daniel started his vicious vows, but that he knew I needed to make this choice for myself. They created a barrier between me and the chaos outside, where Daniel was apparently having a complete meltdown, screaming about the money he had spent and the humiliation I had caused him, his true nature on full display for everyone who had thought he was such a catch. My brother-in-law pulled his car around to a side entrance, and we escaped while Daniel was still ranting to anyone who would listen, loading my few bags into the trunk and driving away from that mansion as fast as legally possible. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life, even harder than the years I had spent under Daniel's control, because now I had to face the reality of what I had allowed to happen to me and begin the painful process of rebuilding from nothing. I stayed with my sister and her husband, sleeping on their couch and having nightmares every night where I was back in that apartment with Daniel, trapped and helpless. He tried to contact me constantly, calls, texts, emails, showing up at my sister's house until my brother-in-law threatened to call the police. His messages alternated between apologetic and threatening, sometimes begging me to come back, promising he would change, saying the vows were just a joke I had misunderstood, other times demanding I return his property, accusing me of theft and fraud, threatening legal action for the money he had invested in me. My sister helped me get a restraining order, and the process of documenting the abuse for the legal filing was excruciating but also validating. Seeing it all written down, all the controlling behaviors and manipulative tactics, made me realize that I wasn't crazy, that what I had experienced was real and serious and classified as domestic abuse, even though he had never physically hit me. I found a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse recovery, and she introduced me to terms I had never heard before: coercive control, financial abuse, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, trauma bonding. She helped me understand that abuse isn't always physical, that Daniel's systematic dismantling of my autonomy and self-esteem was just as damaging as if he had beaten me, and that the shame I felt was a common response among survivors who feel they should have known better or left sooner. She helped me process the guilt I felt about the wedding, about the money that had been spent, about the guests who had traveled, and she helped me reframe that day not as a humiliation but as a liberation, the moment when I finally chose myself over his control. The therapy was painful, peeling back layers of manipulation and recognizing how thoroughly Daniel had infiltrated my thoughts and self-perception, but it was also essential, the foundation upon which I could begin rebuilding a sense of self that wasn't defined by his criticism or dependent on his approval. I went twice a week at first, sometimes spending entire sessions just crying, other times raging at how much time I had lost and how close I had come to losing myself forever. Getting back on my feet financially was a huge challenge, and I'm fortunate that I had family support that many survivors don't have. My old boss at the nonprofit, true to her word, offered me my job back, though in a reduced capacity since my position had been filled. I started part-time, gradually working my way back up as I proved I was reliable and capable despite the massive gap in my resume. I had to explain to colleagues what had happened, which was humbling and difficult, but most people were incredibly supportive, sharing their own stories of difficult relationships or family members who had experienced abuse. I opened a new bank account that Daniel had no access to, changed all my passwords, got a new phone number, and slowly began building a financial life that was entirely my own. It wasn't much at first. I was making barely enough to cover basic expenses, and I knew I would need to stay with my sister for a while until I could afford my own place. But every dollar I earned felt like freedom, like proof that I could survive without him, that his claims of my incompetence and dependence had been lies designed to keep me trapped. The hardest part was dealing with the social fallout and the people who didn't understand why I had walked away. Some of Daniel's friends and business associates, who only knew the charming public version of him, reached out to me saying I had overreacted, that every couple fights, that walking out on your own wedding was immature and dramatic. A few distant relatives who didn't know the full story made comments about my inability to commit or my tendency to run when things got difficult. Even some people who meant well would say things like, "At least you figured it out before you actually married him," as if the 3 years of abuse didn't count, as if the only real damage would have been a legal marriage certificate. These comments hurt, but they also helped me understand how domestic abuse thrives in silence, and how predators like Daniel rely on their public persona to discredit their victims. My therapist helped me develop scripts for responding to insensitive comments, and permission to simply cut off relationships with people who weren't supportive, which was incredibly freeing. I had spent so long trying to maintain relationships at any cost that learning I could set boundaries felt revolutionary. About 3 months after I left, I decided to share my story more publicly, and this decision came after a lot of thought and discussion with my therapist, sister, and close friends who had come back into my life. I wrote a long post on social media detailing the emotional abuse, the control, the manipulation, and the wedding day humiliation, being careful to focus on the patterns of behavior rather than just trashing Daniel personally. I didn't name him directly, though anyone who had been at the wedding or knew us would obviously know who I was talking about. My finger hovered over the post button for probably 20 minutes before I finally hit it, terrified of the consequences but also exhausted from carrying the shame and secrecy that abusers rely on to continue their patterns unchecked. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, I had hundreds of comments and messages, many from women sharing their own experiences with controlling partners, several from mutual acquaintances saying they had suspected something was wrong with my relationship but hadn't known how to help, and a few from Daniel's ex-girlfriends reaching out to say they had experienced similar things and were grateful I had spoken up. One woman in particular, his girlfriend from before he met me, told me she had almost married him too, but had called it off after he proposed, and she recognized every single thing I described because she had lived through it herself. Learning I wasn't his first victim was validating and devastating at the same time. Validating because it confirmed the patterns were real and calculated. Devastating because I realized he would probably do this to someone else after me if no one stopped him. The post also brought backlash, as I knew it would. Daniel's supporters accused me of lying, of trying to ruin his reputation out of spite, of being a bitter ex who couldn't handle being loved by a successful man. Daniel himself sent me a cease and desist letter threatening to sue me for defamation if I didn't take the post down, claiming I was spreading lies that damaged his business and social standing. With my lawyer's help, I responded that truth is an absolute defense against defamation and that I had documentation of everything I had described, including the security camera footage from his apartment that had captured some of his controlling behavior, witness statements from my family and friends, and even some of his own text messages that demonstrated the patterns I had outlined. I never heard back from him legally after that, though the harassment from his supporters continued for weeks until I finally made my social media accounts private and blocked anyone who tried to defend his behavior. But the damage to his reputation was done, and I later heard from mutual acquaintances that several business relationships had soured after my story went public, that at least 2 women he had tried to date after me had found my post and declined to see him again, and that his carefully constructed image as a successful, desirable partner had been irreparably tarnished. Healing was not linear, and I need to be honest about that because I think there's a tendency to present recovery stories as having a clean arc from victim to survivor to thriver, when the reality is much messier and more complicated. I had good days where I felt strong and proud of myself for escaping, and I had bad days where I questioned whether I had overreacted, whether I had thrown away a relationship that could have been saved, whether I was somehow responsible for provoking his abuse. I had moments of intense loneliness when I missed even the toxic relationship because it was familiar, and being alone felt terrifying after years of enmeshment. I had triggers, seeing couples that reminded me of us, hearing certain songs we had listened to, even mundane things like seeing the brand of coffee he preferred at the grocery store could send me into a spiral of anxiety and flashbacks. I had to learn to be gentle with myself, to accept that healing takes time, to understand that having a bad day didn't mean I was back at square one. My therapist introduced me to the concept of trauma responses and helped me recognize when I was being triggered versus when I was experiencing genuine present-day emotions, and this awareness was crucial in not letting the past contaminate my entire present and future. Rebuilding my social circle was both easier and harder than I expected. Some old friends welcomed me back with open arms, never mentioning the years I had ghosted them while under Daniel's control, just grateful to have me back. Others were more hesitant, understandably hurt by how I had disappeared and unsure whether they could trust me not to do it again. I had to do a lot of apologizing, a lot of explaining, a lot of proving that I was working on myself and learning to recognize red flags so I wouldn't end up in another abusive relationship. I joined a support group for domestic abuse survivors, and this became one of the most valuable parts of my recovery. Sitting in a circle with other women, and a few men, who truly understood what I had been through, who didn't need me to explain why I stayed so long or why I gave him so many chances, who could validate my experience without judgment. This gave me a sense of belonging and understanding I had been desperately missing. We shared resources, coping strategies, and hope, and watching other group members at different stages of recovery showed me that it was possible to move forward, to build healthy relationships, to trust again without losing the lessons I had learned. About a year after I left Daniel, I moved into my own apartment for the first time since I had lived with him. It was small, a studio not much bigger than the one I had given up to move in with him, but it was mine and mine alone. I furnished it slowly, carefully choosing each piece instead of having decisions made for me. I painted the walls colors I liked, hung artwork that spoke to me, arranged everything according to my preferences without worrying about someone critiquing my choices. The first night I spent there, I sat on my secondhand couch eating takeout directly from the container and cried tears of relief and gratitude that I had made it here, to this place of independence and safety. I established routines that were all my own: morning coffee while reading, evening walks without having to report where I was going, weekends spent however I wanted without needing permission or approval. These simple freedoms that most people take for granted felt miraculous to me, and I tried never to lose sight of how precious they were, how easily they could be taken away, how important it was to guard them fiercely. My relationship with my family deepened and healed during this time as well. I had done damage there too, pushing them away when they tried to warn me about Daniel, defending him when they raised concerns, missing family gatherings because he had manufactured conflicts or emergencies that required my attention. Now we had long conversations where I apologized and they apologized, where we talked about how we could have better communication and support systems in place for the future. My sister, in particular, became my closest confidant, and I often marveled at how patient she had been, how she had kept reaching out even when I pushed her away, how she had been ready to catch me the moment I fell. She told me later that she had been researching domestic abuse throughout my relationship with Daniel, trying to understand what I was going through and how to help without pushing me further into his control, and that knowledge had informed how she approached me at the wedding and afterward. I realized how lucky I was to have family who educated themselves and stayed present rather than simply giving up on me or enabling the abuse by pretending everything was fine. As I approached the 2-year anniversary of leaving Daniel, I started dating again, which was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My therapist and I had worked extensively on recognizing red flags, establishing boundaries, maintaining independence even within a relationship, and trusting my instincts when something felt off. I went on a lot of first dates that didn't lead to second dates, which was fine. I was learning to be selective, to prioritize compatibility and character over chemistry and charm. I met men who seemed perfect on paper but triggered alarm bells for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, and I learned to trust those instincts rather than overriding them with logic. I met men who were kind and respectful, but with whom I felt no spark, and I learned that being alone was better than being with someone out of fear of loneliness. And eventually, I met someone who felt different, someone who respected my boundaries, who encouraged my independence, who took no for an answer without making me feel guilty, who communicated openly rather than manipulating subtly. We took things slowly, so slowly that it probably seemed glacial to outside observers, but he never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, and that patience itself was a green flag that this was someone I could potentially trust. I also reconnected with my passion for animal welfare that had first brought me to the fundraiser where I met Daniel. I started volunteering at the shelter again, this time being careful to maintain healthy boundaries and not let any relationship interfere with things that mattered to me. I fostered dogs, finding that caring for these traumatized animals who needed patience and consistency and safety helped my own healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was something profoundly therapeutic about giving these creatures a second chance, about watching them go from scared and defensive to trusting and affectionate, about witnessing their transformation and recognizing parallels to my own journey. I eventually adopted a senior dog named Charlie, who had been abandoned by his previous owner, and he became my constant companion, offering unconditional love and a reason to maintain routines and get out of my apartment even on days when depression made me want to stay in bed. Looking back now, 3 years after I walked away from that wedding, I can see how much I've grown and changed, how that moment of saying no set me on a completely different life trajectory. I'm not going to pretend that everything is perfect or that I'm completely healed, because trauma doesn't work that way and recovery is ongoing. I still have nightmares sometimes, still have moments of anxiety when I see someone who looks like Daniel from behind, still occasionally question my judgment or worry that I'm being too suspicious of normal relationship behaviors. But I also have tools now to manage those responses, a support system that understands and validates my experience, and most importantly, a deep conviction that I will never again allow anyone to treat me the way Daniel did. I've learned that love should never require you to make yourself smaller, should never demand that you give up your identity or independence, should never feel like a cage disguised as care. Real love, healthy love, empowers you to be more fully yourself rather than less, encourages your growth rather than stunting it, and respects your autonomy even when it's inconvenient. I want to share this story because I know there are people out there living through what I lived through, people who are trapped in relationships with controlling partners who disguise their abuse as love, who feel like they can't leave because they have no money or nowhere to go, or because they're too embarrassed to admit that the relationship everyone thinks is perfect is actually destroying them. If you're reading this or hearing this and recognizing yourself in my story, please know that you're not alone, that what you're experiencing is real abuse even if no one has ever hit you, and that you deserve so much better. I know it feels impossible to leave. I know the fear is paralyzing. I know the manipulation makes you doubt your own perceptions. But I promise you that there is life on the other side of that relationship, and it's worth whatever it takes to get there. Reach out to someone you trust. Call a domestic abuse hotline. Make a safety plan. Document everything. Save money secretly if you can. But most importantly, start believing that you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity and love that doesn't hurt. To everyone who has supported me through this journey, my sister who never gave up on me, my parents who caught me when I fell, my old boss who gave me a second chance, my therapist who helped me untangle the psychological damage, my support group members who showed me I wasn't alone, my friends who forgave me for disappearing and welcomed me back. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. You saved my life in very real ways, and I hope I can pay that forward by being there for others who are struggling. If this story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar or know someone who has, please leave a comment below and share your experience or your thoughts. Understanding the prevalence of domestic abuse and the many forms it can take is crucial to helping survivors feel less alone and more empowered to seek help. And if you found this story valuable, if it opened your eyes to something you didn't understand before, please hit that like button and subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories of survival, resilience, and hope. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos, because every story we share here is a reminder that we are stronger than our trauma and that our past does not define our future. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, you are worthy of love that lifts you up rather than tears you down, and it's never too late to choose yourself.